Hello, everybody. It's George from Ireland. Welcome back to my channel. Anyway, so in this video, I'm talking about why Ukraine is losing this war. It's been going on for just over 2 years now, there's really no end in sight. Russia claimed to take another 2 villages yesterday. That seems to be true. Question is, how much impetus do the Russians have? But I don't think anyone doubts that Russia does have the upper hand at the moment, even not by much. Ukraine making this dubious claims have shot down about 10 Russian planes over the past week. Probably shot down some of them, but you know the statistics are usually inflated to bolster their morale. Ukraine having admitted to 31,000 combat deaths. Experts think at least twice as high as that. Russia's combat deaths over 80,000 in this war. Again, that's a sort of average of the estimates. But it really comes down to numbers. Sheer weight of metal is going to tell. And I said that since the beginning of the war. I thought Ukraine could win for a while after the summer of 2022 when they had those lightning offensives in September 2022, which would have got an awful lot of media coverage had Elizabeth II not died. And the media spotlight was on her funeral and not on actually Ukraine's victories. But it's turned into a slow, grinding war once Putin's blitzkrieg failed. But Russia's just got almost 4 times the population, the industrial base, a much bigger economy. And I thought that Western countries would see saving Ukraine as an investment in their own security, and they did, but to a more limited extent than I'd anticipated. So they've let Ukraine down time and time again. That anything, since 2014, we can't arm them too much, that would be escalatory. We can't fund them too much, that'd be escalatory. We can't train them, that would be escalatory. And then Putin did escalate by beginning this full-scale war by saying it wasn't going to try to take territory. Then he did try to annex 4 regions and so forth. That everything to try and defend Ukrainian democracy is escalatory. But what Putin does is not. So anything you give them, the Russians will say is escalatory. If you give them water pistols, they'll claim it's escalatory. Anything short of capitulation by Ukraine to all their grossly unreasonable demands, they would say is escalating the tensions in the situation. Well, no, it's not exacerbating it to save Ukraine. And we know the horrors that lie in store for Ukrainian civilians if they're illegally occupied by Russia. Many of them massacred already. But Western countries are just not supplying Ukraine sufficiently. And as it's more of a sitzkrieg than a blitzkrieg, so much of it comes down to artillery and the long-range things like drones and missiles to strike Ukrainian civilian population centers, but occasionally to strike military targets as well. And Ukraine is firing them back into Russia, often hitting Russian infrastructure like oil refineries, electricity stations. You try and damage the enemy economy in war, but it may be unethical and maybe just a waste of munitions. Surely the Ukrainians should concentrate their fire on the Russian military. But Ukrainians just don't have enough shells. It's really that simple. They're firing 10,000 shells a day when they're doing well. Now they're down to about 2,000 shells a day. So they say the Russians are firing 10 times more than that. So 10,000 shells a day, that's roughly 3.6 million per annum. So the European Union promised 1 million shells by the end of spring. It's at the end of March. And supplied over 300,000 already, and they say really it's going to be 500,000. But think about this, and I've been reading what the European Union countries are going to produce in terms of these NATO standard shells, 155 millimeter shells, because NATO has it so that there's interoperability between a shell for a French whatever howitzer, I don't know the correct terminology, they could give it to their Norwegian or their Turkish allies in a war, it'll fit. But not all NATO countries are using exclusively NATO standard artillery shells. They might have some artillery pieces, whatever you call them, which don't use 155 millimeters, but by and large they do. But doing what the European Union countries are going to produce and what the United States is going to produce in 2025, not this year, when they ramp up to maximum production, is going to be about 3.6 million shells per annum. Sorry, what am I talking about? It's going to be about less than that. It was going to be about 1.8 million shells per annum. But the Ukrainians need the 3.6 million shells. So even if NATO, they're looking at the United States and European Union, gave all their shells to Ukraine next year, the Ukrainians need about half of what they need. Now, all right, if some NATO countries are not in the EU, for example, European NATO countries like the United Kingdom or Turkey, like defines itself as as European. So, all right, let's round that up from 1.8 million to say 2 million shells per annum. The Ukrainians would still be well short. It's been found that about 800,000 NATO standard shells on world markets. But if all those 800,000 were purchased, you'd have, well, let's go up to 2.8 million. And that still wouldn't be enough for the Ukrainians to hold their own. So they're not going to get anything like enough. And of course, those 800,000 might never be bought. Maybe none will be bought. There's just talk about it, but people aren't ponying up. And NATO countries have run down their own stocks because they've been gifting shells to the Ukrainians. So half of those at most are going to get to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are not even going to have half the shells they need to do well. And I know that the NATO artillery is usually more accurate than the Russian artillery, so you don't need as many shells to answer. And as I say, it just so often comes down to numbers, not maneuvers, not military genius or anything like that. There's a quality of training, the kit sometimes, but it's just numbers, more troops, more munitions, more of everything. Remember General David Petraeus, who was the NATO commander in Afghanistan, a Dutch American. He's saying you can never have too much. You'd always like more troops, more artillery, more air support, more armor, and that's it. So you'd never turn things down, and so that's why there's a sense of exhaustion. It's growing wearisome for them now. People say that the Russians can't mount a major offensive this summer. They have this slow offensive. Is running out of steam. That they purchase a lot of shells and drones from the Iranians and the North Koreans, but they can't give them any more because the North Koreans say, well, we need them for ourselves. But there's no particular tension against South Korea. Nobody thinks that South Korea is going to invade them or anyone else. And the Iranians, a little bit worried, would Israel attack them when Israel has absolutely trashed Gaza? But I think Israel doesn't want to broaden this conflict, really didn't want to spread across the Middle East. Saudi Arabia probably won't actually against the Iranians because Iran has supported the Palestinians, and there's some sense of Muslim brotherhood at the moment. And actually, there's been a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They reestablished diplomatic relations for the first time in several years. So a conflict between them is less likely than it has been for any time for over a decade. Even in Yemen, the civil war there is cooling down a little bit. Partly the Houthis concentrate their fire on Western commercial shipping as a way of indirectly hitting back at Israel. But nevertheless, the Iranians don't want to sell too many Shahed drones. So that's why Russia's may have some difficulty prosecuting the war on a large scale. They are ramping up their military production. So as I say, that 10-to-1 advantage in shells that the Russians are firing will be growing to 11-to-1 to 12-to-1 to 13-to-1 and so on, and really no end in sight in how much it can grow. There have been more of these stricter sanctions in Russia, and it'll squeeze the economy a bit more. But everybody's surprised it hasn't squeezed it more. Growing maybe 2% this year. Russia might go into negative growth next year, might be -1, but how much can be squeezed? -2% in 2026 or something? Not hugely. And they do have that brilliant woman, Nabiullina, who's in charge of the Central Bank of Russia. And she really has worked wonders. And people have just been amazed how, under extraordinarily straitened circumstances, she's managed to keep the economy growing. And Putin has done everything to make it more difficult for her, with inflation, with labor shortages in key areas, with a brain drain, with these sanctions that he's caused. Imagine how well Russia could be doing if Putin hadn't done all that when they had such a fantastic person in charge of their central bank. So really, and then the Ukrainians have got draft problems. People are deserting, not in huge numbers. People are evading the draft. People are leaving the country legally or illegally, sometimes bribing, sometimes just swimming across rivers, sometimes paying illegally for doctors to misdiagnose them permanently medically unfit for military service. Ukrainians in Western countries just not going back. Western countries not willing to force them to go back. So, and the Verkhovna Rada not passing a conscription act, which would broaden the parameters of those who are eligible for compulsory military service. So some guy's been fighting for 2 years and not had a day off, and say, well, why should I get killed? Why should I get wounded or captured and tortured? Or why should I be see that happen to my mates, or even see it happen to the enemy? I don't want to see their rotting corpses, all these horrors. There's too much trauma. Or why should I be soaked to the skin, freezing away in a trench when I'm ill and getting no food for days because the truck men bring has been blown up, when other guys are living it up back in Kiev or Lviv, or even in Monaco, the Monaco battalion, they call them, of Ukrainian multi-billionaires. And obviously that's true in Russia to some extent. Difference is Russia doesn't have a free media to really report this. And the Russian state is brutal and is efficient in forcing people to fight. So that's why Ukraine may break first, even though they're actually fighting in defense of their homeland. But even Putin is somewhat holding out the olive branch, but obviously you can't trust him. That would simply be a breathing space till the enemy lowers their guard, till Western military aid dwindles to nothing, and then he can try and take it in another go a few months or a few years later. So Western interest in supporting the Ukrainians is dwindling. Yeah, and Trump might come back. So for all sorts of reasons, time is on Russia's side, and the West is just not doing enough. I would love to be wrong. I mean, I don't see an outright Russian victory as in taking the whole of Ukraine ever. But I mean, who could say in a decade? So that's what I think. There'll be some sort of agreement, agreement to disagree, some sort of messy compromise, some constructive ambiguity in 2025, which will leave Russia occupying at least a slice of Ukraine, at least 10% of it, and they've got almost 20% of it now. Anyway, I would be delighted to be proved dead wrong. So please tell me what you think. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate on PayPal. Goodbye.